In a battle of lightning powers, who would win? Hammer-wielding Thor or the mighty Zeus? Could the sun god Ra defeat Hades and escape his terrifying underworld? And could the third eye of Lord Shiva burn Anubis into ash? We'll measure the feats and statements of the gods of many different mythologies, weighing them against their own pantheons and their mightiest cosmic contemporaries around the world. And once we've cracked the code and run the numbers, we'll have definitive proof of which mythology has the most powerful gods. But before we start, we'd like to make it clear that whatever our findings are, this video is not meant to disparage anyone's genuine spiritual beliefs. Our depiction of the legendary figures and gods should be taken with a grain of salt and the knowledge that we don't claim to write the canon. With that small caveat out of the way, let's begin this celestial skirmish by starting with some of the most well-studied gods in the world, the Olympic pantheon of Greek mythology. We've got some serious contenders, folks, from the lightning bolt-hurtling sky god Zeus to the lord of the sea Poseidon to the master of the underworld Hades. These three brothers are the baseline for what makes a powerful mythological god. While most of the other Greek gods and goddesses are mighty in their own right, none can claim to be truly equal in prestige or power to Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. After the Titanomachy, a grand conflict where the gods overthrew the primeval Titans for control of the universe, Zeus and his two most famous siblings gambled amongst each other for who would lead the pantheon. Although Zeus won the coveted spot as father of man and leader of the gods, the fact that the brothers chose a game of chance implies that their skill in combat is comparable enough that a three-way battle between them would have had an uncertain outcome. Of course, this is not the only measuring stick for strength among the Greek trio. Each possesses its own special abilities, unique from the other two brothers. Hades, for example, possesses the supernatural power of invisibility, which, while not boasting the raw, destructive power of Zeus's lightning or Poseidon's oceanic storms, would give the Keeper of Souls an advantage in executing surprise attacks and retreating from the battlefield. The paranoia that might come from Hades' potential presence would be enough to make any of his enemies wary, especially considering that he can manipulate the crust of the earth in order to create gaping chasms and fissures. When Hades stole Persephone from her mother, the earth goddess Demeter, he was able to open the earth, abduct his target, and disappear back below the ground while closing it behind him, all without being stopped by any of the other gods. Though Zeus's eventual intervention led to an uneasy compromise between Hades and Demeter, it is clear that Hades commands great power, especially within the territory of the underworld. As the one who judges the souls of the dead, Hades can inflict elaborate karmic punishments on any soul within his realm. The fate of King Sisyphus is one such example, condemned to forever push the same boulder up the same hill, only for it to tumble back down to the bottom every single time. This ability is less impressive, however, when you realize Hades can only use it on dead humans and quasi-divine beings, such as nymphs and naiads. It wouldn't help him win a bout against another god. His brother Poseidon is better known for messing with living heroes, including Odysseus, whom he turned the ocean against for many years. Though he is a marine god, Poseidon is able to cause terrible earthquakes, thus rendering Hades' geokinesis a non-factor in a fight between them. At sea, he can command the wind and rain, stirring up powerful storms and tidal waves. His greatest feat, however, was creating horses, the equine animals that would go on to revolutionize warfare the world over, as well as become the favorite animal of many young children. Poseidon's powers are still limited, however, in comparison to his brother Zeus, who controls the sky above and can shake the earth just as easily while also dropping lightning bolts from on high. Zeus once defeated the monster Typhon, who was too fearsome for the other members of the Greek pantheon, by lifting up a mountain and hurling it into the creature's head. There's also the father of man's ability to shapeshift into anything from a white bowl to a beam of sunlight, which, while mostly used for, recreational purposes, might have greater capabilities than Zeus lets on. Through these three brothers who represent the pinnacle of the Olympian pantheon, we can understand that a truly powerful god must be able to command the elements throughout a major portion of the mortal realm, at least the earth, sea, or sky. Additionally, they must also be able to hold a position of authority or some important station within their pantheon without being meaningfully challenged by any similar god in that role. Let's see how these Olympians stack up as we move on to our next pantheon, the Norse gods. Even a cursory look at Norse cosmology reveals that the Viking pantheon resides within 9 realms, which are mostly within the control of their leader Odin. A wise and shrewd chief god, Odin made bloody sacrifices to the universe in exchange for greater power. He obtained an infinite source of knowledge by dropping his eyes into the well of Mimir, gained the power to compel other beings through poetry by questing for the mead of inspiration, and became fluent in the runic alphabet and their magical properties by impaling and suspending himself from the Tree of Life for 9 days. Yeah, Norse legends are just kinda metal like that. While the mythological record doesn't feature Odin in combat as much as some of the other Norse gods, he is classified as a god of war due to being the ruler of Valhalla, a great hall for Viking warriors who met their fate in the heat of battle. Odin is more than a mere fighter, he is a strategist of impeccable quality who has foreknowledge of all events within his 9 realms. Odin's wisdom places him a cut above the prior chief gods we've mentioned. For all their elemental fury, the Greek gods were defined in their actions by mortal flaws and pettiness. Zeus's lustful escapades, Poseidon's personal beefs with mortals, and Hades being afraid to leave home most of the time. We can at least relate to that last one. Odin would run circles around these predictable brothers with his intelligence, and his own sons may very well be the Olympians' rivals in terms of strength. His most celebrated offspring is Thor, the Norse god of thunder, who trivializes Zeus's lightning bolts with his own divine weapon, Mjolnir, a striking hammer or axe-like projectile that can kill most beings in the 9 realms in a single blow, as well as summon storms and lightning. Thor's other artifacts include the Megingjord belt, which doubles his already godlike strength, and his chariot-pulling goats, Snarler and Grinder, who break mountains in half as they ride. From the looks of things, the Norse gods are simply operating at a higher level than the great gods. However, they do have a clear weakness, and that's their vulnerability to prophecy. Most of the Norse pantheons are fated to die tragically in a cataclysmic event known as Ragnarok. A lenient reading of this could imply that this means Odin, Thor, and the rest of the kin are invincible in any other battles besides the one destined to be their epilogue. But since we're measuring actual power and not the relative thickness of their plot armor, the fact that the Norse gods can die means they will inevitably die. Their immortality and their overall ability to win fights are limited by the existence of Ragnarok as a concept. In order to go to a higher level of power, we'll need to explore a pantheon that's transcended death itself. We'll have to take a trip down to the Nile River Valley and meet the gods of the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Arising from a watery abyss of primordial chaos and building a new world out of the ether, the various Egyptian gods possessed the elemental control and vast knowledge of the chief gods of previous pantheons, but their portfolio also extends to such universal concepts as order and life itself. The god Osiris even survived his own murder at the hands of his brother Set, becoming a guardian of the underworld and a judge of souls comparable to Hades. Osiris shares the responsibilities over the afterlife with Anubis, who was the original solemn caretaker of the souls before Osiris livened up the place. It can be a bit harder to conceive the power of many of the Egyptian gods, as most of them had more important things to do than get into fights. The Norse, and to a lesser extent Greek gods, were often understood through the lens of warfare, seeing as they had constant battles against mythical beings in many of their stories. The Egyptian pantheon, on the other hand, was rather uncontested in most of their duties, keeping the cosmos balanced as the thriving civilization that worshipped them continued to evolve politically. However, the cyclical, thrilling adventures of one particular deity demonstrates him to not only be a top-tier champion of battle, but also a god that completely transcends the limits of death. His name is Ra, king of the gods, and in addition to being the god of the sun, he is the creator of life and an essential part of Egyptian cosmology. Every day, Ra sails in a mystic divine boat that carries the sun through the sky, and every night when the sun goes down, Ra sails a different boat through the underworld and battles all the monsters of chaos and evil that exist there. Every morning, no matter how difficult the battles, Ra returns with the sun. It's one thing for Osiris to survive death, but for Ra to continually face the symbolic death of traveling into the underworld and returning makes him officially a being beyond the very concept of death. In addition, there are versions of Ra's lore that grant him power over the secretive names of all things. This magical ability is more powerful than Odin's manipulation of the runes, as Ra can wholesale speak beings into existence simply by calling out to their essence. This is an extension of Ra's ability to bring Me'at, or order, from Isfet, or chaos. In this way, Ra not only created the conditions for life to exist within his cosmology, but also gave humanity the capacity to create civilization and pursue higher-minded goals. In terms of power scale, we've gone from the Greek gods that have control over nature and the world of mortals, to the Norse pantheon that has control over many realms and forbidden knowledge, to Ra of the Egyptian gods, who oversees creation and exists above its limitations. This would seem to be the highest power level we can go, but there is one pantheon that reaches an even greater level of divine might. Can you guess which one? The Trimurti of Hindu mythology are a trio of supreme deities that govern not only the creation and preservation of the universe, but also its destruction. However, to attempt to put the role of each member of the Trimurti so simply would be a disservice to how truly powerful they are. In a cosmology where the aspects of creation, destruction, and preservation are given equal weight, our mortal conception of what these processes even mean is called into question. Brahma is the god of creation among the Trimurti, and his origin has a few similarities to the rise of the Egyptian gods. Before Brahma existed, there was only a vast ocean of nothingness, and then he hatched from a golden egg that he himself created before he existed. Once he had a shed in his eggshell, the first god in the Trimurti created all the planets and stars as well as the living things that populated his creation. The exact details of Brahma's role in the Trimurti beyond this description are the subject of continuing academic study and debate. But it's important to note, for the sake of gauging his power, that Brahma can return to creation from absolute nothingness. This means that no force of destruction, not even the next member of the Trimurti who we'll get to, can truly prevent Brahma from simply existing again and creating an entirely new universe. This proves to be one of the only conceivable blind spots of Lord Shiva, who is sometimes referred to as the Destroyer in the context of his role in the Trimurti. Though this title sounds ominous, Shiva is not an evil being. He is in fact, among other things, a yoga instructor and a music teacher who bestows cosmic wisdom upon mortals and gods alike. His true nature is not violent, though he is certainly capable of it when there are demons to destroy. Rather, it's more accurate to think of Shiva as a being that personifies necessary change. Much like the dimension of time, Shiva is impartial and total in his destructive potential. This is shown in one of his iconic aspects, the third eye, which can reduce anything, including other gods, to mere ashes. Once this cycle of reality reaches its natural stopping point, Shiva will destroy every part of the universe and leave behind only nothingness. But as we've established, Brahma can simply bring it all back. But a universe of only creation and destruction wouldn't truly exist in any meaningful way, which is why Vishnu, the third member of the Trimurti, tends to its preservation in his many avatars. Now, on paper, it would seem as though Vishnu could be equal in power to the gods of absolute creation and absolute destruction, but there are several stories that show how powerful he is. Across many of their shared myths, Vishnu and Shiva have fought several one-on-one duels, and the winner is different every time. It's therefore generally believed that the two rival each other in fighting ability. This makes intuitive sense, as Vishnu wouldn't be much of a preserver if he was easily bowled over by destruction. Though given that change is inevitable, Vishnu will sometimes allow himself to take the L if it means something good for the continuation of the universe, in whatever form that may be. When comparing the chief gods across these many mythologies and belief systems, there is no contest that the Trimurti rank highest in terms of power, followed by Ra, then Odin, then Zeus. But the world is much bigger than these mythologies, and there are many other gods out there in the collective human consciousness that have been worshipped as the mightiest of all. So, what god do you think is the strongest? Is there a mythology you want us to explore next? Leave your comments down below. Could the god of the underworld beat the god that can shake the earth to its core? Would the god of war stand a chance against the goddess of war? All will be revealed in today's introduction to the great Greek masters of the universe. Number 20. Morpheus, the god of dreams. Okay, so when it comes to outright power, we're sure some of you are going to disagree with us today on a few matters. Nonetheless, it's not as if Greek gods were always busy having celebrity death matches. When it comes to who was boss, there's room for debate. For instance, who was more powerful, old Morpheus, who could get into your dreams and control them? That's not a bad power if you want to mess with someone's head. Or was his father Hypnos more powerful, since he was the sleep god, albeit a gentle kind of god? We guess Hypnos wins. We mean the god tricked Zeus not once but twice. He put the king of the gods to sleep, for God's sake. That's some accomplishment. His mother was also Nyx, and as you'll soon see, she frightened everyone, including Zeus, who was reluctant to go near her. On top of this, Hypnos' tricks affected the outcome of the Trojan War. So with this in mind, his son Morpheus might not have been as powerful. Still, He didn't just make people dream about their teeth falling out or milking blue cows. He was important because he sent messages from other gods into people's heads via their dreams. If you've seen the movie Inception, you'll know this is a pretty good trick. We like Morpheus, he was a good god. We're not so sure about this next god. Number 19. Tartarus, the god of the abyss. The underworld was a busy place, and we'll come back to it again today. But we'll start with talking about a place below the underworld called Tartarus, which is the name for a god and also a place. Tartarus is actually one of humanity's first depictions of a kind of hell, a dark and gloomy place where you certainly don't want to end up. Some of the titans were sent there, and the wicked could find themselves condemned down there too. In ancient Hebrew texts, Tartarus also pops up. It was the place where fallen angels ended up. If you want to know where the place is, just look to Zeus, because he once said it was as far beneath Hades as heaven is above earth. To give you an example of just how badass Tartarus was, take a look at his son, a magnificent monster if there ever was one, and that was Typhon. Typhon was a winged serpent who wreaked havoc in the heavens and almost once knocked Zeus off the top spot in one of the great battles of Greek mythology. Zeus had his hands full, but he knocked Typhon flat on his winged back after blasting thunderbolts at him. Typhon went on to have a few monsters of his own, so we can say this family line was troubled, and it all started with the big man Tartarus. Okay, so who else was so darn powerful that he could rustle up thunderbolts for Zeus to fire? Number 18. Hephaestus, god of the forge. When we tell you that we're putting a blacksmith next on the list, we'll forgive you for wondering why the hell he gets to go above Tartarus. As we said, this is no regular contest, and also he wasn't just a regular horseshoe-making kind of guy. He was the son of Zeus, and by God did he have some great powers. It was Hephaestus who fashioned the weapons that the gods used, and we mean a lot of them. He was basically the equivalent of all the world's militaries meshed into one. He sat in his palace on Olympus coming up with new ideas as to how to make the best weapons, which included Hermes' winged helmet and Achilles' amazing armor. Pity about that whole heel thing. As we said, he could make thunderbolts too, but in most stories, it was the Cyclops who first made them for Zeus. On top of that, he created the first human woman in Pandora. You might have heard about her box. She opened it and it released all the evils in the world. So yeah, this guy was no regular blacksmith. There are different accounts though as to what happened to him. None of them are really very good. One of them consists of his own mother, Hera, throwing him out of the heavens because he was lame, physically lame. Another account had Zeus throwing him down to earth after Hephaestus tried to help his mom after Zeus came on a bit strong with her. Zeus was renowned for his wayward actions with women. The good news is that Hephaestus' exile didn't last and he eventually got back up to Olympus. Another interesting part of the story is that he once had a relationship with the goddess of love and lust and beauty, Aphrodite. As could be expected with this goddess, she cheated on him numerous times with mortal men and also a god named Ares, who we'll feature soon. Now for the strong men of the gods. Number 17. Atlas, a very strong dude. There were gods and there were the Titans, and the Titans were in fact gods, but they were there before the classical Greek gods we're mostly talking about today. The Titans fought with the classical gods over a period of 10 years, after which the gods won. The battle, or series of battles, was called a Titanocemy. Many of the Titans were then banished to that place you've already heard about, Tartarus. That's the short version of the story, at least. Atlas was one tough Titan. He was also the brother of Prometheus, the Titan that stole fire from the gods and gave it to us humans, so we could basically kick off civilization. You have him to thank for this video today. Atlas wasn't the most powerful Titan by any means, but he was incredibly strong. That's why he gets a mention here. In fact, when that war was lost, instead of being sent down to hell, he was forced to carry the celestial spheres on his back for eternity. Now that's a lot of weight to carry. This next god is just cool, maybe the coolest god of them all. Number 16. Hermes, the herald of the gods. If the gods wanted news, and news was very important, they could rely on Hermes as a messenger to get it to them. Hence, he was the herald god. He was also called the god of nature, farmers, travelers, merchants, human heralds, sailors, and even thieves. On top of that, he was said to be the god of the road between the under and the upper world. He was a complicated god, and there are many stories about him. One of these stories includes him stealing some cattle from the mighty god Apollo, who we will also talk about later. Hermes, then just a kid, hid the cattle in a cave, and he turned the hooves of the animals into winged shoes so that he could take them to any place at incredible speed. Apollo, of course, was less than pleased when he caught Hermes out. He took the boy to Zeus to face the music, and all Zeus did was laugh. He thought Hermes had been pretty smart, and so he didn't punish him at all. Hermes kept those magic shoes so he could easily move between Olympus, Hades, Tartarus, and Atlantis. When news needed to get somewhere, he was the man to send it, and that included delivering messages from Earth to the heavens. He was kind of like media and social media in the godly realm. And as you know, media and social media are pretty powerful tools. He was tricky too, just like any media magnate is today, sometimes using his trickery down on Earth, such as when he got behind the Greeks in the Trojan War. As for his love interests, you won't be surprised to hear he had the hots for Aphrodite. Who didn't? She rebuffed his advances at first, so Hermes went to Zeus for some help. Zeus sent an eagle to steal Aphrodite's sandal, and it ended up in the hands of Hermes. Long story short, she went in search of the missing shoe, and the outcome was some lovemaking and later a child named Hermaphroditus. It's a cool story, but in other tales, Hermes certainly shows his dark side to women. This next god was perhaps a bit nicer. Number 15. Artemis, goddess of hunting, nature, and chastity. Artemis was the daughter of Zeus, the twin sister of Apollo, and she became the patron goddess of girls and all young females. She was also a kind of protector to women during childbirth, which, let's face it, was very important back in those days. When she was just a kid, you could say that she was pretty spoiled, being the daughter of the big man. One story says when she was just 3 years old, Zeus had a chat with her and asked her what kind of things she wanted in life. Part of her reply went like this: "Pray give me eternal virginity, as many names as my brother Apollo, a bow and arrow like his, the office of bringing light, a saffron hunting tunic with a red hem reaching to my knees, 60 young ocean nymphs all the same age as my maids of honor." She also asked for a bunch of rivers and all the mountains in the world. Then she added, "I'll take some cities too, but I'll let you decide which ones." She was given the bow, a silver one made by the Cyclops. If you don't know who those guys are, they were those one-eyed giants who were more than capable blacksmiths. With that great bow, Artemis became the goddess of the wild hunt, which again was a big deal back then. She helped the Trojans in the Trojan War, being mentioned in the Iliad as the archer goddess and the goddess of the loud hunt. She's also notable for killing the giant hunter named Orion, after he either tried to force himself on her or possibly one of her followers. As you know, Orion ended up becoming a star constellation. This goddess was so special that humans in real life built a massive temple for her, which took 100 years to finish and became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Number 14. Nike, the goddess of speed, strength, and victory. Long before she came before the words Air Jordan, Nike was one hell of a goddess. During that 10-year fight with the Titans we told you about, she was one of the first to give her support to Zeus. For that, she got to sit next to him on the throne. This girl was all about winning, and Zeus knew to keep her close. The Roman version of her was Victoria, from where we get the word victory. Her story is a bit complicated since over the years she's been talked about as if she was the goddess Athena, but it seems at some point she became her own goddess. Details are a bit scant as to what exactly she did besides making people win, but one text states she will not live apart from Zeus, nor go except where the god goes before them, but they sit forever beside heavy booming Zeus. It's said that when Typhon was giving Zeus a really hard time close to the end of the Titanochemy, it was her who told him many of the gods had already given up, and if Zeus wasn't careful, all the gods could kiss Olympus goodbye. She then told him to get those thunderbolts ready. So whether you were a god fighting or a mortal fighting, you really wanted the loyal Nike on your side. Not exactly clear what unique power she had, but you definitely needed this goddess on your side in times of war. You also needed this next god. Number 13. Demeter, goddess of grain and agriculture. This is also a bit complicated, but we'll try to condense it. In short, a god we'll talk about soon named Kronos had a bunch of kids. They were Chiron, Demeter, Hades, Hera, Hestia, Poseidon, and Zeus. Kronos ruled over everything, and things weren't so bad in those days, hence his rule was called the Golden Age. Still, he was told a prophecy that his sons would end up taking over one day. Not one to ignore a prophecy, Kronos thought that it was better to swallow up his children rather than bring them up. He did that, but things backfired. Part of the backfiring was Kronos was having to throw up his kids, one of them being Demeter. She became exceptionally powerful because she was the giver of food or grain. She was the goddess of the harvest. Without food, there is no life. So Demeter had a lot of respect for mortals. One story says it was her who brought poppies into the world, and those things were certainly useful once humans had sucked out the opium pulp and fed it to an injured or sick person. It's also said she spent a lot of time down in the underworld, and that could represent the end of harvests and the beginning of winter. The reason she was down in the underworld would take a long time to explain, but in short, it was because of her daughter Persephone, who was stuck down there. Persephone's father was Demeter's brother, Zeus. The gods were very, very incestual. When Demeter popped back up from the underworld every year, hey presto, she made food plentiful again. It seems she didn't get too involved with the seedier side of godly life, although it said she once laid with a mortal guy in a field, and then out of anger Zeus zapped that guy with a thunderbolt. There's also a darker part of the tale in that her brother Poseidon once turned himself into a stallion, and in that guise made her pregnant. Now for everyone's favorite god. Number 12. Dionysus, god of all things pleasurable and crazy. Okay, so that isn't his official title. He was the god of a lot of things, including the grape harvest, wine, i.e. getting loaded, as well as fruits and orchards. But he had a dark side, just as recklessly drinking booze has a dark side, because he was also the god of lots of forms of insanity. He was the god of religious ecstasy, which can also be a double-edged sword at times in regards to going mad. The Greeks had something called the Dionysian Mysteries. These were rituals where folks got off their heads on wine and then perhaps psychoactive drugs. Historians aren't so sure what drugs, but perhaps during those rituals people tripped. Then they found a kind of religious ecstasy. They were released for a few hours from their normal selves, just as what happens when people do certain spiritual ceremonies involving psychoactive substances. So if you wanted to really feel elevated from the drudgery of everyday life, Dionysus was the guy. His backstory is cool too. He was the son of Zeus, but Zeus, as usual, had been cheating on his wife Hera. She got jealous, and the upshot was the mortal woman with Zeus's kid getting blasted with thunderbolts. Zeus saved Dionysus by storing him in his thigh until he got older. So we'll talk about the god that's been said to be the opposite of Dionysus, Apollo. But first, let's talk about a very scary goddess. Number 11, Nyx, goddess of the night. We guess you've already figured out that the philandering Zeus didn't take crap from anyone. Sure, he had a few close calls when it came to fighting, but he was one tough son of a gun. Guess what though? There was one god he was scared of, and that was Nyx. She was the mother of Hypnos, but she was also credited with being the mother of death, deceit, doom, destruction, and darkness. How's that for a family tree? Not that much was ever written about her, but the Greeks said she was so damn attractive and unbelievably powerful that the mighty Zeus wanted nothing to do with her. For that reason, we could even put her at the top spot in this show. Still, we don't think she earned that place because there aren't enough stories about her. There's one cool story in which Hera asked Hypnos to put Zeus to sleep. Zeus was mad as a hatter and was about to cast Hypnos into the sea, but Hypnos ran to his mom for protection. Yep, Zeus chickened out. He wanted no part of Nyx, so yeah, she could have been higher on this list, as could this next goddess. Number 10, Gaia, goddess of earth and life. This one is tricky too when it comes to comparing power, because Gaia, like Nyx, wasn't one of the Olympian gods, but one of the primordial gods. First, there was chaos, and chaos gave birth to the earth, Gaia, death, love, and sex, Eros, and the sky, Uranus. Gaia and Uranus gave birth to the Titans, and in turn the Titans gave birth to the Olympians. Stephen Hawking would probably disagree with this creation story, but let's face it, it's a much better narrative than the Big Bang Theory. Since the Titans gave birth to the Olympians, we can say Gaia kicked off everything. She also advised Zeus so he could beat the Titans. But on the other hand, it was her who gave birth to Typhon. It's hard to really speak of her power, but seeing as she basically started everything, and we mean everything, she can't not be on the list. Now for Apollo, the god the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said was the opposite of the beloved Dionysus. Number 9, Apollo, the god of law and order, music, art, and poetry. He was also the god of healing and diseases. If Dionysus was the god of recklessness and pleasure, Apollo was the kind of god of restraint and reasonableness. He also had the ability to bring plagues, but he also had the ability to bring healing to people. He helped young folks get older and age with good health. He protected them just as he protected the crops in the field. If evil ever reared its ugly head, Apollo was the god to turn to. In that regard, Dionysus might have been cool as hell and good for a bit of self-development, but Apollo was the stability that everyone needs in their lives. As for cool stories, we like the one that has Apollo fighting the Python. The Python was a kind of dragon-type thing that guarded the gate of the Oracle of Delphi. An oracle, if you didn't know, could counsel you and tell you about the future. Anyway, Gaia was the mother of the Python, and Apollo knew from birth that he had to kill it. Zeus's wife Hera had sent the Python to kill Apollo's mom while he was still in her womb. Legend has it that Apollo was still an infant when he slew the Python. Gaia was less than pleased and asked for Apollo to be sent to Tartarus, but instead, Zeus just sent him into exile for a while and said, "Purify yourself, kid." There's a lot more we could say about Apollo, but we'll leave it there. He was a top god, no doubt about it, as was this next deity. Number 8, Aphrodite, goddess of lust, passion, procreation, prostitute, sex, and beauty. You could have all the power in the world, but still be a feeble loser in the face of impossible beauty. You could be as strong as Atlas, as wise as Zeus, as fast as Hermes, and still be manipulated by a woman whose charms you can't resist. For this reason, Aphrodite was one very powerful goddess. She has a pretty brutal backstory too. Someone we'll soon talk about, Kronos, castrated his father. The outcome was quite a lot of blood and the missing testicles being thrown into the sea. The bloody froth in the sea is what formed Aphrodite. She represents the sex drive, and it's that drive that's the reason why we all exist. We are here to procreate. in the fundamental sense anyway. That's why some scholars have said she was behind all the wars. The Trojan War was partly down to her. But as we said, she was the goddess of procreation, so she was responsible for death and also life. She was what made men love. She could also drive mortals and gods insane with a desire. She drove lots of folks crazy, including the good-looking mortal Adonis. So, like Nyx, there's an argument that Aphrodite was as powerful as any god. She proved that too. Anyone who didn't do what she said, or for some reason was not concerned with her beauty, often ended up being cursed by her and suffering a terrible fate. Zeus actually once got angry at her, saying something along the lines of, "Hey, your specialty is love, not war. What the hell do you think you're up to?" She did her own thing, that's for sure. But now we'll talk about a couple goddesses who could have probably given Aphrodite a run for her money. Number 7. Athena, goddess of war and wisdom. Her father was Zeus, and she had no mother. That kind of thing could happen in Greek mythology. She apparently grew out of Zeus's forehead. She was also behind a lot of heroes, being the goddess of heroism. Did you ever watch those old movies, Clash of the Titans and Jason and the Argonauts? They were based on the legends of Perseus and Jason, monster-killing men who embodied heroism. In Homer's great book, The Odyssey, Athena is the goddess that counsels the hero Odysseus. She was also one of those 3 goddesses behind the Trojan War with Aphrodite and Hera. For this reason, it's hard to say who is the most powerful of those goddesses. They were all pretty tough, to be honest. She might have been a war goddess, but her kind of war was just, and she fought her wars with great wisdom. Remember that all those heroes she was behind had to use not just brawn, but brain. Her brother Ares was quite the opposite. He was more about outright violence and bloodshed. In terms of power, we can't really separate them either, and that's why he's next on the list. Number 6. Ares, god of war. If Athena said, "In war, to win, we must strategize, take our time, and the least amount of blood will be spilled in our victory," Ares might have said, "If you're courageous and fearless and fight like a lunatic, you might just win this, even if you're the last man standing." That's why the Greeks said Ares was more in tune with the savage. For this reason, he was often mocked in Greek mythology for being a bit of a jock, a reckless god who always tried to settle things with his fists. He once slept with Aphrodite as she cheated on the great toolmaker Hephaestus, so Hephaestus wrapped them both in a net and then made them look pretty stupid. This is what Ares' father Zeus once said to him: "Do not sit beside me and whine, you double-faced liar. To me you are the most hateful of all gods who hold Olympus. Forever quarreling is dear to your heart, wars and battle. And yet I will not long endure to see you in pain, since you are my child, and it is to me that your mother bore you. But were you born of some other god and proved so ruinous?" Was this savage more powerful than his sister? We think not. They can share the same place on the list. We'd love to tell you that in the real world, the Athenas are more prominent than the Ares, but we'd be lying. Brute strength has outdone wisdom many, many times. Number 5. Hera, goddess of marriage, family, women, and childbirth. Hera was the sister and wife of Zeus. So, even if you doubt her power, she was married to arguably the most fearsome god of them all. But we'll come to that matter soon. As the stories go, she fell in love with her brother at a young age, but Zeus wasn't exactly a faithful sort of guy, and we're not sure the Greek gods had anything close to a prenup. Zeus cheated on her time and again, with gods and with mortals. His offspring was pretty impressive to say the least, but this made Hera very jealous, and also very vindictive toward the people that Zeus got it on with. To be fair to them, turning down Zeus was never an easy option. Hera herself was far from kind at times. When her stepson, the hero Hercules, was still in the womb, she sent witches to prevent the birth. That didn't work out, so she sent serpents to kill the baby, but Hercules made short work of them. He strangled them and then played with their dead bodies as if they were toys. He's only not on this list because his mom was immortal, but suffice to say, Hercules was a handful when it came to scrapping. Hera doesn't come across as being the most powerful of the gods, but you sure wouldn't want to get on her wrong side. She was very cunning, and if she plotted against you, it was trouble. Now let's talk about her very tough father. Number 4. Kronos, leader of the Titans. We've mentioned this chap a bunch of times already because he plays a very important role in Greek mythology. Before Zeus ruled the roost, Kronos was in charge. Kronos was jealous of his father, the god of the sky, Uranus. His mom was Gaia. It's a long story, but what you need to know is that Gaia told Kronos and his brothers to attack Uranus. Only Kronos did, and he did it with a sickle, castrating him. From blood in the ooze, Aphrodite and others were formed. Uranus was understandably a bit peeved by this, and so he called his sons Titans. Kronos then married his sister Rhea, and the two ruled the heavens and earth together. But as you know, he was told that one day he'd be overthrown by his own kids. So he did what anyone would do, and he swallowed them. When Rhea had her last kid, Zeus, Kronos said, "All right, hand him over, it's swallowing time." Rhea wasn't really keen on this idea and instead handed him a stone covered in swaddling. It seemed Kronos, as powerful as he was also a bit stupid, because he fell for that, and he swallowed the stone thinking it was the baby. Zeus grew up in a cave, and when he got a bit older, he gave something to Kronos to make him throw up. Out came Zeus's brothers and sisters one by one. In time, his brother Poseidon got his trident, and his brother Hades got his helmet of darkness. Zeus got his thunderbolts. Now it was time to fight. As you know, Kronos lost the war. He might have also been castrated by Zeus, but that's debatable. He did get sent to Tartarus, but Kronos still deserves to be in this place. He ruled over everything for a time, and that 10-year war was no walk in the park for Zeus and the others. Still, he lost, so let's move on. Number 3. Poseidon, god of the sea, storms, and earthquakes. The ancient Greeks knew very well that one thing that could shatter everyone's life was the earth itself. When it quaked, it destroyed, and it was Poseidon that could shake the earth. He also ruled the seas, which the Greeks also feared, especially when Poseidon decided it was storm time. You can't really get any more powerful than that. He was also the god of horses and created the great winged horse named Pegasus. Still, we should mention that when he once went to battle with Athena, he lost, so we'll forgive you for telling us we're wrong here. However, being an earthshaker is just such a good superpower. Like Zeus, Poseidon had more kids than he could count. Many of them monsters and savages. That was probably a genetic thing, because catch Poseidon on the wrong day and he could be a complete psychopath. Annoy him and you could forget your ship ever getting to its destination. Then again, the way the Greek gods acted, they were all a bit mentally unhinged by today's standards. All in all, Poseidon could pretty much destroy the land and make water deadly, so we're leaving him at number 3. As for 2, here goes. Number 2. Hades, god of the underworld. If you're going to give credit to the devil for having a fair bit of power, you gotta give credit to Hades too, since they both ruled over the underworld. Still, bear in mind, if you're going to give credit to the devil for having a fair bit of power, you have to give credit to Hades too, since they both ruled over the underworld. Still, bear in mind that the Greek underworld wasn't hell, that was Tartarus. This makes all 3 of them very powerful. Hades wasn't a bad god, even though we tend to think of the underworld as a bad place. But he was feared because he took no crap from anyone. If you went down to see him, you weren't getting back, not usually. For this reason, the Greeks were incredibly scared of Hades and didn't even like to mention his name. If anyone tried to cheat death, they would feel Hades' wrath, and by God, no one wanted that. Sisyphus tried it, and he ended up having to push a ball of rock up a slope for eternity. And that's why we now call futile things Sisyphean, a hard, never-ending task like moderating Twitter. Hades could be one powerful dude, if he wanted to be. It was written that if he felt like it, he could split the earth in half. If you don't believe us, here's some ancient text about him. Hades splitting open the earth to reach Persephone crashed towers and shook towns to their foundation. It amazed Hephaestus and frightened the Cyclops. It shocked Athena, Artemis, and Persephone and frightened Aphrodite. It frightened the sky and caused the stars to move out of their courses. Seriously, would anyone mess with that? All we're gonna say now is that if for some reason Hades, Poseidon, and Zeus got in a fight, there'd be nothing left except chaos. Why then do we have Zeus in the number 1 spot? Number 1. Zeus, the king of the gods and the sky. There's actually some ancient Roman poetry that has Zeus saying, "My rank is no greater than Hades. I hold court in the sky, another rules the sea, and one in the void." Humans and the gods were all scared of Hades and were happy about the fact that he spent his time down below. Zeus understood his power, but Zeus at the end of the day just had more influence in the goings-on in the world and heavens. Still, Zeus was hardly a moral character, sleeping around with just about everyone and anything, and sometimes coming down too hard on people. You can argue that Hades was a better god, but at the end of the day, Zeus was pretty just at times, and he was supremely intelligent. If things really went to hell, you could rely on Zeus to sort things out. Hades and Poseidon, meanwhile, might sit back and just let things happen. As we said, the Greeks did fear this kind of fight. If those 3 fell out, it would mean the end of everything. But an all-out fight wouldn't happen because Zeus would know better. He was the king for a reason. His rulership was contested from time to time by other gods, but Zeus remained on the throne. Poseidon had some run-ins with him, but in one text he admitted, "I'd wish none of us to quarrel with Zeus, the mightiest of us by far." Giant snakes capable of swallowing celestial beings whole. A crocodile-headed ladies' man who can be as big a lover as a fighter. A dog-headed afterlife judge with a pet who devours hearts and souls. And a brotherly dispute that leads to dismemberment and resurrection. That's right, you're about to experience a true battle of the gods. The ancient Egyptians were one of the most advanced and successful civilizations in the ancient world. Their culture as we know it began with the unification of the region's Bronze Age tribes in 3100 BC under King Nemer, and despite it being conquered and invaded numerous times, ancient Egypt lasted all the way up to 30 BC. when the land was officially annexed by the Roman Empire. During those thousands of years, Egypt became an extremely influential culture. They were innovators in architecture, mathematics, literature, and agricultural science. But perhaps the most striking aspect of the ancient Egyptian culture was their religion. The Egyptian gods were incredibly important to daily life in their time and have continued to capture people's imaginations for thousands of years. But today, we're not here to talk about the different cognates of Isis or how Horus was used as a tool for political gain. We're asking the real questions about the Egyptian pantheon. Which god was the most badass? Could Sobek beat up Thoth? This is our ranking of the most powerful Egyptian gods. As with many things to do with history this old, none of this is definitive. Although themes and motifs reoccur across stories, there was no set canon when it came to the Egyptian gods. Back in the day, religious stories were often used for political purposes, to reinforce social norms, or to prove a point, so each god's power level tends to vary depending on the opinions of the person writing the story down. For example, the most commonly accepted version of Egyptian myth states that Ra was king of the gods, but if you're from Memphis and your city's patron deity is Ptah, you might prefer the local version of the creation myth, where Ptah is actually bigger and more important than Ra. But for clarity's sake, we're going to go off the versions of these myths that are the most popularly retold today. Hopefully, there won't be too many ghosts and time travelers starting Heliopolis versus Thebes flame wars in the comments. And just to make things a little more spicy, we're going to give each of these gods a power rating out of 10, with 1 representing the wimpiest you can possibly be while still being considered a god, and 10 being a god so powerful that the other gods would consider you a god. Let's go! Number 13, Waset. Starting at the bottom of our list is Waset. Even though her name means powerful woman, and she had a city named after her, she was rarely ever depicted, and no temples dedicated to her have been identified. So even though she's sometimes shown with a bow and arrow, it's not really clear what she did with them. Egyptologist John Ray has referred to her as the theological equivalent of the girl next door, and it's easy to see why. Waset was probably a nice lady, but she wasn't very exciting. What we do know is that she was the first wife of Amun, before later being replaced by Mut. Although, depending on who you ask, Mut might be just a later evolution of Waset, which is a hell of a glow-up, considering that Mut is sometimes called the Queen of the Universe. We'll give her a generous power ranking of 3 out of 10. Can our next god show us what real power looks like? Number 12, Nepri. Next, let's take a look at Nepri, a god of grain whose name means Lord of the Mouth. When depicted as an adult, Nepri is a human man covered in dark freckles, which represent scattered grains. This poor guy seems to have a real problem standing out. He is very rarely depicted on his own. Most of the time, he's shown as a baby suckling on his mother Renenutet, goddess of the harvest. Then later on, when Osiris's cult gained personality, Nepri got folded into Osiris's legend. After a while, he was no longer considered a god in his own right, instead being rebranded as a facet of Osiris's role as the god of rebirth. Nepri has failed to impress. Let's give him a ranking of 2 out of 10, partly because we feel sorry for him. Number 11, Nefertum. Next we have Nefertum, the god of beauty. Nefertum is the son of Ptah and Bastet and was born out of the first lotus flower that bloomed out of the primordial soup of the world. Usually he's depicted as a beautiful man with blue hair and a crown of water lilies, but since his mother is a cat goddess, sometimes he can also take the form of a lion. Nefertum's domain included things like sunrises, clear water, and the smell of fresh flowers. These are all very pleasant things to be the god of, but they don't exactly scream powerful. Still, statues of him were thought to bring good luck, and some hymns in the Book of the Dead suggest that Nefertum's floral perfumes are what gets Ra up in the morning. So maybe we all have Nefertum to thank for the world not existing in complete darkness. For that, and the fact that turning into a lion is pretty badass, we're going to give our fragrant boy Nefertum a slightly more respectable 4 out of 10. Number 10, Bastet. Next is Bastet, Nefertum's mother. Bastet is a cat-headed goddess who is the defender of kings of Egypt as well as Ra. She was the goddess of pregnancy and childbirth, as well as a powerful protector against evil. She's depicted fighting Apep, the monster snake, on behalf of Ra, and Egyptians often pray to her for defense against evil spirits and curses. Other than that, though, she doesn't appear in many stories, so if she had any crazy powers or got into any epic battles, the modern world will likely never know. Still, she is a protector against evil, and she's able to fight a scary giant monster snake. We think that'll earn her a very respectable 6 out of 10. Number 9, Ra. Speaking of Ra, he's up next in our ranking of the most powerful gods. Ra has the head of a falcon, and according to legend, every morning Ra gets up, picks up the sun, and carries it across the sky in his boat. Even if you're not that familiar with Egyptian mythology, you might be aware that Ra was the king of the gods. So you might be confused as to why Ra is so low in the ranking. Well, like most kings down on Earth, even though Ra holds a lot of institutional power, that doesn't exactly equate to physical strength. Many myths depict Ra as old and weary, preferring to sit up in the sky and delegate responsibilities among his children. It's easy to understand why he's always tired though, because every night at sunset when he reaches the gates to the underworld, he has to fend off a Pep, that same giant snake monster who often beefs with Bastet. It really seems to us like Ra could use a few days off. Because carrying the sun is something we've personally never done, we think Ra earns a place with Bastet on the 6 out of 10 power scale. Praise Ra! Number 8. Osiris. Next is Osiris. Ra was the king of the sky, but Osiris is the king of the underworld. He was depicted as an undead pharaoh with mummy bandages and rotten green skin. He's the god of life and death, responsible for the cycles of crop growth and judging the souls of the dead as they enter the afterlife. Osiris is a very culturally important god, but he loses a lot of power points by being the only one on the list whose backstory includes dying. While he was alive, he was a noble king of the Black Land, the most fertile part of Egypt. His jealous brother Set, whose domain was the desert, decided to usurp the throne by chopping Osiris up into pieces and dumping his body in the river. Sure, he eventually got better, but still dying is pretty embarrassing for a deity. But for coming back from the dead and being the king of the underworld, which is metal as hell, we still think he deserves that 6 out of 10. Things are going a power level up from here. Number 7. Anubis. Now let's look at Anubis. Anubis might be the most famous of the Egyptian gods, and he's also one of the coolest. Anubis had the head of a jackal and was the god of funerals and mummification. He had an important role as the guardian of burial sites and the one who performed the mummification of Osiris before he was resurrected. Anubis didn't take very kindly to Set, who was in the form of a leopard, running in to mess up his workstation, so Anubis subdued Set, branded him with a hot iron, and peeled off his leopard skin, and then wore it as a warning to anyone else who tried to interrupt embalmings of burial ceremonies. Also, Anubis was one of the council who judged the souls of the afterlife. He would take the heart of the deceased and weigh it on the scales of life and death. If it was too heavy, it would be fed to Anubis's pet, a crocodile-hippo-lion hybrid monster called Amit the Devourer. So even though Anubis typically doesn't start fights, he is definitely the kind of guy who finishes them. Personally, we think all of these badass feats plus his scary Devourer sidekick puts him firmly in the zone of 7 out of 10 on the power scale. Now we're talking. Number 6. Thoth. Alongside Anubis in the Judgment of Souls was Thoth, who was in charge of writing everything down. Thoth was the god of writing and knowledge, and it was his job to settle disputes between the other gods. Now, if you know anything about classical mythology, you'll know that you would have had to have been pretty tough to take on that job. Thoth is a scholar, not a warrior, but he is still extremely powerful. This ibis-headed god can talk his way out of any situation. He was the one who gave Isis the words to bring Osiris back from the dead and offered counsel to her son Horus during his epic battle with Set. Thoth also gambled with the moon for a fraction of its light and won, which gave him the power to change the length of the year from 360 to 365 days. Thoth is also Ra's personal secretary and assists Anubis in judging the souls of the dead. Basically, if it's a battle of wits, nobody's beating Thoth. He's also the one who talks Sekhmet into returning home, and once you get to know Sekhmet, you'll appreciate how amazing it is that he survived that interaction. Weighing his physical setbacks against his genius-level intellect and silver tongue, we think he's earned a place with Ra on that beautiful 7 out of 10 tier. Number 5. Sobek. For the total opposite, let's consider Sobek. Sobek is a crocodile-headed god whose role is a little hard to pin down, because in regions where he was worshipped, he tended to dominate and take attention away from every other member of the pantheon. But if you had to condense him down to one concept, the most accurate way to describe Sobek would be the god of animal instincts. He had a huge appetite for both food and sex, and was said to be irresistible to human women and goddesses alike. In addition to his spectacular virility, Sobek was also closely associated with military power and was fiercely loyal to those who worshipped him. So, sure, Sobek might not have been a genius, and he might have once taken a bite out of Osiris, but he is a true ride or die, and you definitely would want him in your corner. For his sheer level of chatliness, we think Sobek swims his way to another strong 7 out of 10 on the power scale. Women want him, men want to be him, and he's an inspiration for crocodile-headed people everywhere. Number 4. Sekhmet. Next is Sekhmet, the daughter of Ra and goddess of vengeance and the plague. She's one of the most theologically significant goddesses from ancient Egypt, and she's definitely also the scariest. Sekhmet had the head of a lion and would be sent to Earth to enact vengeance against those who angered her father. She could breathe fire, spread diseases, control hordes of locusts, and had an unquenchable thirst for blood. Legend has it that she single-handedly almost wiped out the human race on one of her visits, indiscriminately killing and draining everyone she saw. The other gods knew that they had to band together to stop her, so they devised a plan. Make a lake of beer, and then dye it red so it looks like blood. The trick worked, and Sekhmet drank so much that she got too drunk to remember what she was so angry about. She returned home, leaving the survivors of her rampage to repopulate the earth. When she got over her hangover, Sekhmet was enraged that her father had tricked her, so enraged in fact that she left the kingdom of Ra, vowing to never return. But without her flaming hot rage to sustain it, the sun started to dim, and it only returned to its full brightness when Thoth talked her into forgiving Ra. Sekhmet is clearly an order of magnitude scarier than all the gods we've seen before, especially considering it took all the gods teaming up in order to stop one of her legendary rampages. If that doesn't earn her an 8 out of 10 on the power scale, we don't know what does. Number 3. Set. Next is Set, the god of storms, violence, and chaos. He's sort of a, listen, we don't really know what animal Set is meant to be. Egyptologists gave up trying to figure out if he was a dog, an okapi, or an aardvark, and instead, they made up a new theoretical creature called the Set animal. Whatever animal he is, he's not someone you want to mess with. As the god of chaos, Set is a wild card with a lot of strength and cunning. His 2 main roles were to serve as Ra's bodyguard in the nightly fight against Apep, and as the rival of Horus. He's the only god on this list to have killed another god when he chopped up Osiris. Set fought with Horus over who would have control over the Black Land for 80 years. During that time, Set was able to rip Horus's eye out, bait him into decapitating his own mother, and even nearly sexually assaulted him. And throughout this conflict, Set had an unfair advantage, since Set's role as Ra's bodyguard gave the king of the gods a bias toward his favor. All in all, Set's about as close to an evil god as Egyptian mythology gets. He may not have had the sheer raw power of Sekhmet, but given that he's a literal god killer, a ruler of chaos, and his evil schemes have tricked other gods into destroying those close to them, well, we can't approve of his actions, but we definitely think it earns him a very scary 8 out of 10 on the power scale. Number 2. Horus. Next after Set is his eternal rival Horus. Horus is an essential part of ancient Egyptian culture, so much so that historians believe he was one of the earliest gods ever worshipped in the region. Originally thought of as a sky god, over time his role shifted, and he became seen as more of the god of kings. No, not the king of gods, although he also had a falcon's head. The god of kings. Stay with us here. Horus was the god who guided and protected the pharaoh, and he was sort of the idealized version of what someone in the role should be like. And since the pharaoh was the head of the military, Horus was naturally also incredibly gifted in battle. Horus was able to beat Set in every contest, and he even managed to rip off one of his testicles in one of their battles. He also chopped off Isis's head in the heat of one conflict. Even though she was able to heal, replacing her head with the cow's head, decapitating Isis would have been no mean feat. Given he's an incredible talent and facing off against other incredibly powerful gods and winning, we gotta give the God of Kings an incredibly respectable score of 9 out of 10 on the Egyptian god power scale. But is there a god powerful enough to take the number 1 spot? Oh yes, dear viewers, oh yes. Number 1. Isis. Now for the best of the best, the top of the list, the most powerful god in all of Egypt, Isis. Isis is the mother of Horus, the wife of Osiris, and the sister of Set. Yes, she's also Osiris' sister. It was a different time. Isis is the goddess of fate and of the cosmos, with immense magical powers that rivaled all of the other gods put together. The book Daily Life of the Egyptian Gods even went as far as to call her more clever than a million gods, suggesting that her intelligence would rival even Thoth. Isis can turn herself into just about anything and is a master of using psychological tactics against her enemies. At one point, she lures Set, pretending to be a princess caught up in an inheritance dispute that mirrors his own. In other stories, she even fights Set one-on-one using her magical powers. Isis is willing to do anything to help her son maintain his power, even screwing over her fellow members of the court of the gods. She once conjured a venomous snake that bit Ra, and then she used the antidote to bargain with Ra to learn his true name, which, if passed on to Horus, would bolster his royal authority. Isis's power was matched only by her popularity. Even after the fall of ancient Egypt, Isis remained popular in Greece and Rome, and some historians even believe that she was part of the inspiration behind the Virgin Mary. For all of this, we think Isis has earned the Holy of Holies 10 out of 10 on the god power scale. That's what she earned for literally being the goddess of the cosmos. Another day dawns in ancient Egypt, and a man gets up to greet the day. He has a family, responsibilities, and pleasures waiting for him in the day ahead, just like everyone else. But he's no ordinary man. He is the Pharaoh, the ruler of the Egyptian Empire. So what was it like to be one of the most powerful men in the world? Well, it was very different from being an ordinary citizen of Egypt, and in some ways, not different at all. From the moment the pharaoh wakes up in the morning, they're not alone. That's because one of the defining characteristics of being the king was being surrounded at all times by loyal servants. It wouldn't do to have the king and his family tackle the dirty tasks of day-to-day living by themselves, would it? So the royal palace is staffed by countless servants who each play their own role in keeping the place humming. The pharaoh has help getting dressed, has someone preparing his meals for him, and has someone to bring him anything he wants throughout the day. It's as if he has a classic butler staff, but times 100. And he's not the only one who has help. The pharaoh's family is also surrounded by servants. The queen has her own staff, usually made up of women, to tend to her needs, while the kids are assigned royal nannies and tutors to guide them as they age. After all, dad has an empire to run. And with a staff this big, you can't expect the pharaoh to run the whole operation. The palace would usually employ a royal controller who is essentially the boss of the servants. They would keep track of them, assign them to roles, and ensure their performance was up to par so bad news doesn't get back to the boss. But the servants don't just stay in the palace. When the pharaoh leaves the palace, he's usually escorted by a team of servants as well. Some might be responsible for carrying the pharaoh's litter or guiding the horses driving him in a chariot. Others would have an even more important duty, guarding the pharaoh's life. These bodyguards were among the most highly trained members of the servant class, often dedicating their life to sharpening their combat skills. Other strong servants might be tasked with maintaining the palace, taking the lead on construction projects, and working the royal fields. But were these servants or something else? It's commonly portrayed in the media that ancient Egypt was run by slaves, both residents of Egypt and foreign slaves who were captured. But in actuality, most of Egypt's workforce, including those who built the pyramids, were paid servants. That didn't mean that they were free. Once you worked for the king, there really wasn't any way to quit, and you were pretty much stuck in the servant social class. But servants weren't without rights. Their children could move up in the social order, and trusted servants were often valued members of the pharaoh's household. And there was a lot for these servants to keep track of, because the pharaohs lived opulent lives. For the pharaohs, getting dressed was not a quick process. For most peasants, they would put on a simple garment and be ready for a day of labor. The pharaohs, however, dressed to impress. That meant that they would likely spend a good deal of time in the morning getting their regalia in order with the help of their servants. One of the most common pieces of gear a pharaoh would wear was an animal skin, often of a large predator like a leopard or a lion. This was supposed to show that the pharaoh feared no beast, although it was likely that the pharaoh never got close to the source of that pelt. And that wasn't the only way the pharaoh would try to impress. The headdress was one of the most important parts of the pharaoh's regalia, with some wearing a specially designed cloth known as a nemes. These striped cloths usually had a one-of-a-kind pattern weaved by one of the pharaoh's trusted seamstresses. Others would wear an impressive crown, often adorned with jewels and precious metals. These could be heavy, but it wasn't like the pharaoh was going to be doing hard labor while wearing it. The main job of the pharaoh on a day-to-day schedule was to serve as an imposing figure and pass judgment based on the advice he was given. But that's all it really was, advice. Was the pharaoh truly an absolute monarch? In a word, yes. During the days when Egypt was an independent empire, the pharaoh was not only the king, he was generally considered an avatar of the gods, and was trusted with power over life and death. His word was absolute, and angering the pharaoh could mean death. But at that same time, he was largely disconnected from the world around him. He spent most of his time in the palace, learned about the affairs of the common people from his advisors, and his decisions were likely heavily influenced by their perspective, which meant his most trusted advisors might have been the ones pulling the strings. But that doesn't mean the pharaoh couldn't make huge changes. Under most eras of ancient Egypt, the people followed a polytheistic faith that worshipped a pantheon of gods led by the mighty Osiris. But under the pharaoh Akhenaten, it was deemed that the state religion would change to a mostly monotheistic one, worshipping only the sun god Aten, who happened to be the pharaoh's namesake. It didn't really catch on, but the public had no choice but to largely comply during his lifetime, at least publicly. But one absolute monarch can just as easily reverse another's decision. His son, King Tutankhamun, the boy king, almost immediately chose to restore the old religion, and being an absolute monarch can mean major risks. While things largely worked out with the boy King Tut, there was still a preteen on the throne, suddenly, and that could have gone very badly. Fortunately, he was heavily influenced by his advisors and his reign was mostly inconsequential. But while Egypt didn't have too many mad kings that we know of, unlike Rome's infamous Nero and Caligula, all it would have taken was one hereditary monarch who didn't want to listen to his advisors and kept on making bad decisions for things to go south in a hurry. Of course, the advisors and military leaders had a tendency to take over after pharaohs died suddenly, so maybe they were just stepping in before things went too badly. And for future pharaohs, the training began early. What was it like being a child of a royal? In a word, great! While Egyptian children as a whole had a better quality of life than children in many countries thanks to Egypt's wealth, they still weren't exactly living the comfortable life many children experience today. Commoner children would likely be working in their parents' trade from a young age. Royal children, though, lived in the lap of luxury. While any sort of long-term public education was a rarity for commoners, the royals typically had tutors working for them. They would typically be accompanied by minders from a young age, but how involved the pharaoh was in their upbringing would vary. It wasn't uncommon for a crown prince to be given responsibilities in his father's court to teach him the way of the world. But for most Egyptian royal children, it was likely a life of leisure. Studies of ancient Egyptian artifacts have found evidence of childhood toys and games, including board games that resemble ones still played today. It's likely these children had the run of the palace when they weren't in lessons or being supervised by their parents. Evidence shows that the ancient Egyptians, commoners and royals alike, greatly valued their children and stayed involved in their upbringing. However, there is no question that royal children likely had a lot more fun on a day-to-day basis than their commoner counterparts. And having the run of the palace meant quite a lot of opportunity. Egypt was the largest and most powerful empire in the world at the time, and it wouldn't do for a mighty pharaoh to live in a palace that didn't reflect it. While the most impressive structures in Egypt were undoubtedly the pyramids at the Gizeh Acropolis, there's no question that the Egyptian palaces we've learned about were among the most impressive ever constructed. The best-known one is Malkata, the New Kingdom Palace of Amenhotep III. Located on the bank of the Nile in Thebes, it was mostly built out of mud brick and is estimated to have taken 18 years to complete. It was the largest royal residence ever constructed in Egypt, and they made good use of that space. Among the many features in the palace was a large artificial lake connected to the Nile through a series of canals. This eliminated the need to bring fresh water to the palace manually. The palace was filled with multiple halls, villas, courtyards, and smaller palaces, and apartments for the associates of the pharaoh. And the pharaoh's private quarters were almost a palace in itself, with 4 rooms including a bedroom, a dressing room, and even a harem's quarters. A massive temple dedicated to his wife and honoring the crocodile god Sobek was on the grounds as well. But time had a way with even this mighty palace. Today, little remains of Amenhotep III's glorious palace besides its foundations, but they're enough to create an impressive visual of just how big the palace was. There's no question that the pharaoh and his family lived in luxury, with a sprawling palace complete with massive dining room where they would eat… Wait, what did they eat exactly? Obviously, the food of ancient Egypt was a very different beast than today's cuisine. Few modern cooking implements existed, and all food was sourced locally. But the food of the pharaohs was still very different from that of the commoners. Commoners didn't have access to many luxury goods, but surprisingly the staples of both were the same, and they both came down to the same crop. Wheat, the largest crop in ancient Egypt, was the stuff of life. The base of meals for all people was bread and beer. The bread was typically made from emmer wheat, while the beer was typically cloudy with plenty of unsifted solids. As such, it was more like alcoholic gruel than Miller Lite that we all know. But that's where the similarities ended. Fruits and vegetables were also served to the pharaoh, with the most common local crops being garlic and scallions. That'll add a pop of flavor, but it's not exactly going to fill you up. The availability of other crops like lettuce, celery, cucumber, and gourds, as well as fruits like dates, figs, and raisins were varied. These were typically considered luxury crops, although the working class might be able to get a hold of some when there was a surplus. The fruits would often be dried to preserve them for longer, and the pharaohs would usually have access to them throughout the whole year. But where's the beef? The Egyptians were fairly advanced in domesticating animals, and they raised cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. They also hunted birds and fished in the rivers, giving them ample supplies of meat. Only the poorest didn't have access to any animal protein, usually subsisting on legumes instead. But hunting and raising animals was a time-consuming process, and subsistence farmers often didn't have the time for it. While the meat on the table would be modest for them, it would be anything but for the pharaohs. There's evidence of the ancient Egyptians raising massive numbers of oxen, with the workers building the Great Pyramid being served beef every day. And for the pharaohs, life was likely a never-ending buffet. The pharaohs had the resources to raise large numbers of domesticated animals, and if they wanted a specific meal, they could always send their servants out to hunt for it. That meant the table was usually filled with wild birds, beef, mutton, pork, fish, and anything else they could get their hands on. This was also the era when one of the most famous delicacies in the world was invented: foie gras. This deliberately fattened goose liver was developed back in the 25th century BCE. They were also fond of eating a much smaller bird, sparrow, which reportedly had aphrodisiac properties. And the pharaoh would build up a big appetite because he was actually pretty busy all day. The day would start with him being dressed and cleaned by his servants, including anointing him with scented oils. Once he was wearing all his robes and jewels, he would go to the audience chamber. There he would face his daily meetings. But don't worry, they would be flattering. After all, he's a king who is also considered a god, and those in the meetings are a combination of commoners, noblemen, and visiting dignitaries. The odds are every single one of them would bow before him as they entered, often presenting him with offerings. The only ones who would not seem to show this level of intense devotion are his everyday advisors, but even they would probably bow to the pharaoh. But even the pharaoh answers to someone. After the daily audiences, the pharaoh would likely go to the temple to pay his tribute to the gods, making the daily offerings with the assistance of the high priest. This is a time of quiet devotion. But it's not just religion that guides him to do this. He's also seen as the shepherd of the country, and if it was to descend into chaos under him, he could be ousted in a coup, potentially even by his own military leaders or advisors. So dutifully, he talks to the statues of the gods and then sacrifices cattle to them with the help of the royal butcher. It's a private affair for the pharaoh, only accompanied by a few trusted people, and it's a rare moment of quiet reflection for the man who rules all of Egypt. But then it's time for the pharaoh to leave the palace. You can't carry out all the royal duties from the safety of the palace, and what would be the fun in that? So it's time to head out on the daily errands, but the pharaoh isn't going to be walking on his own 2 feet. That would be undignified. It would also be risky. So he's likely going to pick between 2 main forms of transportation. The first is the traditional horse-drawn chariot, very useful for when you need to go fast. In fact, many pharaohs like to use the chariots for recreation as well, using them to hunt or race other chariots. Or he could go under foot power, but not his own. The royal litter is a device used for thousands of years, and it's as simple as can be. A small chamber containing a comfortable seat for His Royal Majesty, attached to several poles that will be carried by entrusted servants. A small litter might be transported by only 2 people holding on 2 poles, but larger ones, like those fit for a king, would likely be transported by 4 people at a time. This would be the ideal mode of transportation for a king out on local errands. So, what would a king actually get up to on his daily errands? The pharaoh usually had a lot of different construction projects going on at a time, with each site being run by a royal foreman. He would regularly visit each site, getting a look at the progress and presenting any updates to the plans. He would also take general tours of the city to let people see him. This is a useful way to build up the loyalty of the local population and keep them from becoming disconnected from the royal family. This is the biggest event of the day, with many locals crowding around to catch a glimpse of the man they view as an avatar of the gods, and from there, it's back to the palace for dinner and a relaxing night's sleep. The pharaohs seem to live a charmed life, but one area poses concerns. The pharaohs were powerful in almost every way, but they were also mortal. Many of them had surprisingly short reigns, including the famous King Tut, who was on the throne by age 9 and deceased by age 18, likely from a combination of health conditions he was born with and injuries suffered in what might have been a chariot accident. While the pharaohs had access to better healthcare than the average Egyptian citizen, they also lacked access to modern medicine because it hadn't been invented yet. And that meant they were vulnerable to a whole host of conditions. The Egyptians did have some surprisingly modern medical techniques, including minor surgeries to repair broken bones and sew up injuries. And they had access to a number of medicines, but one area they were lacking was modern antibiotics. The Egyptian doctors did seem to understand basic principles, while there was no understanding of concepts like bacteria back then. Some ancient texts used fermented beer as a treatment for infections. It may have been better than nothing, but it wasn't as effective as modern treatments, which meant there was always a risk that one minor cut could turn into a serious infection and end anyone's life, even a king's. And there was another major risk factor to being a pharaoh, and it started way before they were even born. Who was worthy enough to marry a pharaoh? Well, clearly not a commoner, and most lower-tier nobles probably didn't qualify either. Clearly we gotta keep it in the family, so Egyptian royal families were heavily inbred. It was common for kings to marry a sister, often a half-sister from one of the previous pharaoh's other wives. This reduced the genetic inbreeding, but it was still common for pharaohs to be born with genetic conditions. King Tut was born with a club foot, scoliosis, and potentially a genetic condition like Marfan syndrome that might have contributed to his early demise. But with Pharaoh's death isn't really the end. Death was right around the corner for everyone in ancient Egypt, and they were firm believers in an afterlife, so it was common for pharaohs to begin planning for their death long before they were expecting it. One of the most important tasks of a pharaoh's life was designing their own tombstone, ranging from an impressive memorial palace to a magnificent giant pyramid that would hopefully still be standing thousands of years later. These tombs are among the most significant architectural achievements left from ancient Egypt. It might seem morbid to plan so thoroughly for your own death, especially as a young kid, but because the Egyptians had such a literal view of the afterlife, it was almost comforting. Death, no matter how or when it happened, was just the next step of the journey, and they wanted to be well equipped. In addition to building their final resting place, they would often carefully pick what they'd be taking to the grave with them. This often meant their most treasured possessions, plus a healthy supply of food just in case. Despite how often the media brings it up, sacrificing one's servants to take with you in the afterlife was exceedingly rare, although animal sacrifices were very common. And when the pharaoh passed on, his history would repeat itself. Sort of. The pharaoh's day typically begins with his servants dressing him and preparing him for the day, and that would happen one last time after death in a much more thorough manner. This time they would be preparing for a mummification. This would include removing all the tissues filled with liquid that would be most likely to rot, including the brain and most of the internal organs, which would be preserved in canopic jars. The body would then be embalmed and placed in an ornate coffin where it would be laid to rest in the massive tomb that had been built, preserved in a mostly airtight chamber where it would remain surprisingly intact thousands of years later. And soon a new pharaoh would take the throne, with a strict schedule and a huge team of servants to help him carry out the task of ruling the greatest empire in the ancient world. Want to know more about one of the craziest theories relating to ancient Egypt? Check out evidence that points to Egyptian pharaohs being aliens, or watch this video instead.